Hallo miteinander, I'm Gesh86 and this is part 2 of Labyrinth of Touhou. I'm going to select the same file as before, but this time I'm not going to venture into the dungeon. Instead, I'll tell you a little bit about the options in the main hub. First one is the Hakure Shrine. In the Hakure Shrine, you can level up all your characters if you've accumulated enough XP for them. Now, we have all our characters here now. Let's select Chirano. By confirming one more time, we get a selection of all these stats. Now, these stats are your hit points, how much damage you can take, your spell points, how much spells you can cast, your attack, which is the offensive stat for physical attackers, your defense, which helps against physical attacks, your magic, which is for magical attackers, and one more thing, some characters actually have attacks that are both physical and magical, which take both of these stats into account, and these attackers are composite attackers. Incidentally, Chirano is actually one of these. She has composite attacks, but also normal physical attacks. The next stat is Mind, which protects you against enemy magic attacks. Speed, which determines how fast your active gauge increases and fills up. So, how early a character gets her turn and how often she can attack, and if she can attack more often than a boss. Evasion is actually a bugged stat that doesn't work at all, so don't increase it. Now the last 6 stats are your elemental affinities. Depending on how high a value of a certain character is, the more or less damage you take from this certain element if it's used against you. All your attacks usually have an element. Some are non-elemental, against which enemies can't protect, and some enemy attacks are also non-elemental, against which you can't protect. Now, some characters are very susceptible to damage to a certain element or are very resistant to it. Now, if you know, fire plus Chirano equals water, so don't let Chirano get hit by a fire attack. Chirano naturally has a good cold affinity, so cold attacks will do a little less to her. But just increasing these affinities by level up won't be enough, but that will be for later. I'm going to select attack for her now, because that is pretty important for her. The next option is the magic library. Now, I've mentioned the skill points earlier. All the skill points that you gather through battles and through finding treasure can be spent here. Now you see all these stats again. You boost them up in the magic library, and depending on how often you boosted them up, you get certain bonuses. So the higher the bonuses are. Now, all these stats have different costs depending on just how good a character is with this stat. For example, Reimu is good with magic, so it'll cost usually less, even if it's on a higher level. The more you increase it, the more skill points you'll need for the next upgrade. For example, if I would look at the defense stat for Pachuri, it's only at level 7, but it already costs 210 skill points. That is a lot, because Pachuri's defense is really, really poor. If you choose a relatively balanced setup for your skill points and concentrate a little bit more on the stats that a character is good in, usually you have the best result. In the Scarlet Devil Mansion, you can select your roster, all your active members and your passive members. But there are also 3 other options. You can remove all your party characters if you just want a completely new setup. For example, if your current one doesn't work for boss or isn't really good for grinding experience. You can also unequip all characters if a certain boss requires certain equipment, and you would just have to exchange so much equipment that starting from scrap would be the best idea. If you've just put a character out of your party and that character still had equipment on them, you usually can't reuse that equipment. So what you do is you unequip them with the 3rd option, unequipping non-party characters. So you can use this equipment again. Another space is for entering the dungeon. I've already showed how it looks in the dungeon. And Akiu's house is for saving and loading the game. Recording your journey, the first option here, is for saving the data. And reading your records is loading the data if you want to use another file or some other reason. Back to Gensokyo just cancels and gets you back to the main hub. Now in this screen, if you've unlocked certain achievements in the game, they appear here. They're the so-called stars in this game, and there are 7 of them, but you won't be able to unlock even the first one before reaching floor 20. If you don't get these stars, you won't be able to advance much further. I want to show one more thing at the Hakode Shrine. Usually you level up 1 at a time, but only if you're playing, like me, version 2.04. If you have the newest version, 3.01, you can actually select level up many times at once by, I think, just toggling these stats. Also, if you're playing 3.01, if you don't like a certain character portrait that much, for example, Hong looks so sad in her default portrait, you can go on the internet and download alternate portraits for your character and insert them in a certain folder, and then you'll have different character art for this game. Also, when you're playing at least version 2.06 or higher, beating the 30th floor unlocks New Game Plus. Then you have all 40 characters from the start when you're starting a new game, and you can use characters earlier that you couldn't use before. And you can, for example, do some nice challenges for yourself when you say, I'm only going to use these 12 characters. Yes, you can have a lot of fun with that. Now, the final thing I want to show is about equipping items in general. Now, you have a lot of items. There are 150 items in the game. Some items only increase your basic stats. That is usually good for grinding or for characters where you need a lot of attack power. But there are other items that are probably even more important to you. Now, for example, there are items which greatly increase your elemental affinities. For some bosses, it's almost necessary to take higher elemental affinities with you, because they use, for example, a really strong fire attack. And if you don't use these items, even if you have good defenses, your characters are just gonna be wiped out, because against these elements it's really the best way to reduce damage by equipping certain items. There are also items that for example, increase your SP recovery, which is really important if you don't want to run out of SP early, or if a certain boss can drain your SP to 0, so that your character recovers much faster from this. And there's another kind of item that is really, really important. These kinds of items that increase your affliction resistance. Now, your afflictions resistance protects you against certain ailments or afflictions if you want. There is poison, paralysis, silence, instant death, and stat drop. Now, if you tackle a certain boss that really dishes out all these ailments against you without this ailment resistance, for example, they're going to use instant death attacks and you have no protection against these, you can have really strong characters, but they're just going to get wiped out. Or if a boss is able to paralyze you, your character is just going to be able to do nothing for a really, really long time, and it can really destroy all your strategy, and you just need to prepare for these boss fights. In this game, you're just not going to get far if you completely neglect these ailments and elemental affinities. That was all I wanted to explain about the main hub of the game. I'm Gesh86. Until next time, bis bald.